Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, by Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers, narrated by Allyson Johnson. Introduction. Mistresses of the Market. In 1859, after touring the antebellum South, the journalist and New York Tribune editor James Redpath attempted to explain for his readers why white Southern women opposed emancipation. He believed that their sentiments were tied to a lifetime of indoctrination, reared as they were under the shadow of the peculiar institution. Slavery was incessantly praised and defended virtually everywhere they went, by everyone they knew, and in most of the publications they read. Their consciences, thus early perverted, were never afterwards appealed to, with the result that they saw no reason to change their views. Redpath assumed that white Southern women did not know Negro slavery as it is, because their society shielded them from the institution's horrific realities. Insulated by Southern patriarchs, white women seldom saw slavery's most obnoxious features. They never attend auctions, never witness examinations, seldom, if ever, see the Negroes lashed. More profoundly, they did not know that the interstate trade in slaves was a gigantic commerce. Southern men revealed only the South Side view of slavery, and if the women of the South knew slavery as it is, he was convinced, they would join in the protests against it. Redpath's assumptions represented a commonly held patriarchal view, yet narrative sources, legal and financial documents, and military and government correspondence make it clear that white Southern women knew the most obnoxious features of slavery all too well. Slave-owning women not only witnessed the most brutal features of slavery, they took part in them, profited from them, and defended them. Martha Gibbs was one of those women. Lit Young, one of Gibbs' former slaves, was interviewed as part of the Federal Writers Project, FWP, of the Works Progress Administration, WPA, established by the Roosevelt administration in 1935. According to Young, Gibbs was a big, rich Irish woman who weren't scared of no man. She owned and operated a large steam sawmill on the Warner Bayou in Vicksburg, where it emptied into the Mississippi River. She also owned a significant number of slaves, so many, in fact, that she had to build 2 sets of whitewashed quarters with glass windows to house them all. She also built a nice church with glass windows and a brass cupola for their worship. She fed them well, but she worked them hard, too. In step with other slave owners throughout the South, Gibbs employed an overseer to make sure that the people she kept enslaved performed the tasks delegated to them, but she also oversaw her overseer. Almost every morning, she buckled on 2 guns and come out to the place to personally ensure that things were running smoothly, and she out-cussed a man when things didn't go right. Twice married and once widowed, Gibbs would not permit either of her husbands to interfere with her financial affairs, including the management of her slaves. Even though her second husband was a reputable physician in Vicksburg, he had little influence over her or the slave-related activities on their plantation. Lit Young remembered Gibbs' husband addressing her after witnessing the brutal whippings her overseer inflicted upon her slaves. He softly interjected, "Darling, you ought not to whip them poor black folks so hard. They's going to be free just like us sometimes." Unfazed, she snapped, "Shut up! Sometime I believe you was a Yankee anyway." She was right. During the Civil War, he served the Union forces by treating injured soldiers. After the Confederates surrendered, and for reasons that remain unclear, local Union officers arrested Martha Gibbs and locked her up in the black folks' church, where they kept her under constant guard for 3 days, fed her hardtack and water, and then released her. After the soldiers set her free, Gibbs freed her slaves, but only temporarily. One day, when her husband had gone to buy corn for his livestock, she gathered up some of her slaves, 10 6-mule wagons and 1 ox-cook wagon, and set off with them. They walked about 215 miles, from Vicksburg, Mississippi, to about 3 miles from Marshall, Texas. She hired Irishman guards with rifles to make sure that none of her freed slaves ran away during the journey, and when they stopped to rest, the guards tied the men to trees. Then, on June 19, 1866, 1 year after these legally free but still enslaved people made her first crop in Texas, Martha Gibbs finally let them go. Married slave-owning women like Martha Gibbs have received scant attention in historical scholarship. Historians have acknowledged that some Southern women owned slaves, but they usually focus on the wealthiest single or widowed women. When they do encounter married slave-owning women in 19th century records, they generally assume that the women's legal status as wives prevented them from owning slaves in their own right. Historians rarely differentiate between married women who owned enslaved people in their own right and married women who merely lived in households in which they engaged with, managed, and benefited from the labor of the enslaved people that others owned. Historians rarely consider why slave ownership might have mattered to the women in question, to the enslaved people they owned, to slaveholding communities, to the institution of slavery, or, more broadly, to the region. Historians have neglected these women because their behaviors toward and relationships with their slaves do not conform to prevailing ideas about white women and slave mastery. While it has long been recognized that Southern slave owners were in the minority and that they were by no means a homogeneous group, so much of what scholars know about women in the slaveholding South draws upon the diaries or letters of the most elite, those living in households that owned more than 10 enslaved people. Historians have chronicled these lives, producing microhistories about an extremely small subset of an already small group of white Southerners. Such studies should not be used to make generalizations about the majority of women in slaveholding communities at large. Records indicate that the majority of slave owners owned 10 enslaved people or less. Scholars who examine the authority that women held over their slaves frequently focus on the women's obligatory rather than voluntary or self-initiated management and discipline of enslaved people. They argue that women could not be true masters of slaves, rather they were fictive masters. Even when they possessed the skills and the gall to manage their slaves, these historians argue, they typically did not relish their power. They did not view their activities as slave mastery, and neither did Southern laws and courts. This was especially true when it came to violent forms of discipline. White women might punish enslaved people. They might even be brutal and sadistic, but they fell short of wielding a master's power. In sum, these scholars argue that slave-owning women's acts of violence differed from those of slave-owning men. By extension, many of these scholars flatly reject the idea that white married women could adeptly manage enslaved people without the assistance of men, be they white or black, or that, aside from a few exceptional women, they could possess the acumen to do so while also effectively running plantations. Married women, they argue, begrudgingly assumed roles as deputy husbands and fictive widows when their husbands were away. When their men were present, these women happily and enthusiastically relinquished such responsibilities and exhorted their men to handle what one historian has called a man's business. And in the view of more than a few historians of American slavery and the domestic slave trade, this was especially the case when it came to the business of buying, selling, and even hiring enslaved people. These scholars claim that the nasty and unseemly business of transacting for human beings was considered ill-suited to white ladies. In They Were Her Property, I build upon these earlier studies, but I also depart from them in significant ways. I focus specifically on women who owned enslaved people in their own right, and in particular on the experiences of married slave-owning women. In addition, I understand these women's fundamental relationship to slavery as a relation of property, a relation that was, above all, economic at its foundation. I am not suggesting that this was these women's only relationship to the institution, or that the economic dimension of their relations overrode other aspects of their connections to slavery. Rather, I argue that pecuniary ties formed one of slave-owning women's primary relations to African-American bondage. The story of these women's economic investments in slavery, I shall argue, tells us much about their economic roles in the institution and the process of nation-making that historians did not know or want to know about before. The economic historian Sven Beckert has argued that slavery was a key part of American capitalism.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?